Hello, Kate. Good to meet you. Thank you for joining me.
Good to meet you. Yeah, thank you for doing this.
So let's get to know you a bit then in terms of your Quaker journey. Can you tell us about what has been your journey into Quakers, especially in Britain, I suppose, but there might be a backstory to that for you. Um, what were you seeking and what did you find?
I'll probably have to start way back. I grew up in an Irish Catholic family in the Jim Crow South. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, during the time of the civil rights struggle, and that's an important part of my story. My family was pretty devout Catholic. I went to Catholic schools for 12 years. Got very, very comfortable with the Catholic doctrine and comfortable with it in terms of very deeply educated in it, but not very comfortable with it, in fact, because of what I saw going on in the background of my life at that point in Atlanta and in the South in general. Um, Dr. King was alive for much of my childhood, all of my childhood, and much of my adolescence. I heard him speak once, and I can honestly say it had a huge impact. It has an impact on me today. The idea that there were people living in my city whose experience of life was very, very different from mine
Mm.
because of the color of their skin, something they had no control over. So in the meantime, I was in Catholic schools and struggling with the idea of God that came to me from that. The God who is all loving, all powerful, all knowledgeable, and yet also angry and capricious and jealous. And it seemed to me that whatever I did, there was always another hurdle to be jumped before God would love me. Do you know? That no matter what I did, I was never quite enough. It was never quite enough. And that I couldn't really be, I wasn't really worthy of the love of God. And I struggled with that a lot. And then in the meantime, there's also the Apostles' Creed, which we learned and recited once a week in school. And for me, the story of Jesus I find really compelling, the kind of life he led, as far as we know from what's written. Um, but in the Apostles' Creed, here's what it says about Jesus. He was conceived of the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, died, and was buried. It seemed to me that the whole story lived between born of the Virgin Mary and suffered under Pontius Pilate. And that part was left out of what we routinely said we believed. The part about loving your neighbor and the part about forgiving people and the part about um, uh, uh, welcoming the stranger and tending the sick and doing the kind of work that I saw going on around me, but not in the white community, not in the Christian community. And so for me, when I went to university, I always had this idea of God that wasn't that one. It wasn't the sort of the God who created us imperfect and then punished us for being that way, and the God who sent God's own Son to die for our sins, and yet that wasn't enough to clear the ledger. Do you know? I mean, all of this, the idea that I was born with, tainted by the sins of people who historically didn't really exist, Adam and Eve. I just threw it all out. But I still had this idea of God, and it was about, for me, it was about justice, and it was about fairness, and it was about goodness, and it was about loving one another. And so while I was at university, I sort of looked around at the religions that were on campus and looked for one whose idea of God fit my own. And there weren't any Quakers on my campus, sadly. Um, and I couldn't find one. So I just kind of threw it all out and went on with my life and my career. Spent a lot of my focus on my career, forgetting a lot of what I felt as growing up. But and that focus, but I still had this sort of God-sized hole in my heart that I couldn't fill. Yeah.
Mm.
And that brought me to a 12-step program. where I was told that if my idea of God didn't work for me, I could find one that did. I could change it. I could find my own idea of God, which I'd never heard that before. It was like a revelation. It really was. It's
Mm.
like, here's where I found what I was looking for. In this place nobody wants to end up. And yet, for me, it was the beginning of opening my heart and finding a way that eventually led me to Quakers. And so I went on for a while with that. The 12-step program is a powerful spiritual program. And the result of doing the 12 steps is a spiritual awakening that I found as well, and that worked for me. Fast forward, my husband, Dan Flynn, and I were in York. He had some business in York about 13, 14 years ago. And Sunday morning, I was wandering around at loose ends, and about 11 o'clock, I found myself near Friargate Meeting House. And I've always been Quaker curious, and in fact, had sort of jokingly said for many years, if anybody ever held a gun to my head and made me choose a religion, it'd probably be Quakers, you know. So I went in to see what it was all about. And I have to say, the welcome I received was exactly the welcome I needed. It was friendly, but not too friendly. It was warm, but not pushy, and it was just perfect for me. And I went into meeting for worship, and I sat there and I thought, I don't know if I can stay here quiet for an hour. And the next thing I knew, the hour was over, and I felt like I was home. This was what I had been searching for, this connection that I felt from that first meeting, that connection to something deep and personal and universal at the same time. Um, and I truly think I've always been a Quaker, but I didn't know it until then, until
Mm.
that moment. Um, so I talked to Dan, my husband, and Dan Flynn, and Dan's very active and very gung ho, and I wasn't sure he could sit still for an hour. He wasn't sure he could sit still for an hour either. So we live in Belgium. We've lived in Belgium since 2001. And so we found a meeting in Belgium, and we went, and he had the same experience I did, that this was something that was profound and deeply important to us. And so we became Quakers. Um, and there's so much of that experience that's tied up with through sort of a series of events. We ended up living in Quaker House, Brussels for 6 years, sharing the house with Andrew Lane, who was director then.
Mm.
And in that time, I did a lot of volunteer work with the Quaker Council for European Affairs, QCEA. And that work, in some ways, that's where I learned what it means to be a Quaker, to me, what it means to me to be a Quaker. It started with some work about migration. It's a story of my Irish family forced to leave their country. Many died on the way, and when they got there, nobody wanted them. So for me, the parallels between the migration story of the Irish and the civil rights movement in whose midst I grew up were there. There are parallels. They're very different. Colonization is not the same as enslavement, but still there was that same sense of being forced to leave your country and not welcome when you got there. And so I did work on migration. I went to, at that time, they still had the camp, the refugee camp in Calais, the jungle.
Mm.
And I went there to work, to volunteer. And I was there at the time when they were dismantling the camp. And they sent all the adults away, and the unaccompanied minors were left alone in the camp with nobody who spoke their language. And it was a really difficult thing. It took me 3 weeks to stop sobbing every day when I got back. Um, and so from that, we QCEA sponsored a program called Helping the Helpers, where we found long-term volunteers who are working in the refugee camps, and and dealing with the same vicarious trauma that I had felt. And we found some Quaker psychotherapists who specialized in trauma
Mm.
and designed a year-long program to teach people how to recognize the vicarious trauma that they were picking up, how to shed it, and how to stop to avoid traumatizing the people they worked with, and to teach other people how to do that. And that's had also a long-term impact for me. Two of the participants of that later formed their own small charities, and they're continuing that work, which is just a wonderful, amazing thing.
Mm.
And at the same time, QCEA has participative status in the Council of Europe. To my knowledge, it's the only Quaker organization who is involved at that level. And so for 4 years, I was the representative. I was the representative Quaker in Strasbourg. And so we took information about helping helpers to Strasbourg and had a big exhibition there. And for me, it showed me when I first time I went to Strasbourg and as a Quaker, the waves of goodwill that came to me, unearned by me, earned by many people behind me,
Mm.
showed me how respected Quakers are at that level of operation. But at the same time, I know that that's not a level where I work very well. The level of politics is not mine. My ministry is more on the ground. So we got very much involved in Quaker House with migrants who were passing through Brussels and hosting them when the weather got bad. And there was nothing happening in Quaker House. We would bring people in to spend the night and wash their clothes and let them get warm and fed and have clean clothes and then go back out to whatever their fate was. Um, and that for me was very much an important part of how I am a Quaker. Um, because when the directorship changed and we moved out of Quaker House, um, I continued that work, but not so much in Britain, but also in not so much in Brussels, but also in Britain. And partly because I enrolled in Woodbrook's Equipping for Ministry course. I
Mm.
was part of the last group to actually go through that. And in there, we talked a lot about our ministry, about our work in the world, how we let our life speak. And for me, my ministry has always been around racial justice and around migration and around that whole sense of people forced to leave their homes in
Mm.
one way or another. And my grandparents taught me that the other side of asylum is exile, that you are shut off from the culture that you know and the people, everybody you know and love, and you can never go back there.
Mm.
And that I think is something that's lost in all of the discussions about migration and about certainly about enslavement. There's not always a recognition of that sense of sort of the cultural break that happens and the sense of being lost in a culture that's not yours. Um, so that's kind of how I came to Quakers. Sorry. What I found was what I've always been searching for, and also a ministry that keeps me challenged. It keeps me on the edge of exhaustion and wouldn't ever want to give it up. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah, the edge
or
of
maybe on the edge of
exhaustion.
burnout is that. Yeah.
Well, it's really interesting. Yeah. Can I, listen, I mean, there's so much I want to ask you about. Can I go back to asking you to say a bit more about Martin Luther King? Because not everyone has that experience.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I mean, just tell us a
yeah.
bit more about that. Do you have any memories and stories that you can give us a picture of what that was like? Because you said it really formed you.
It did. It did. I as I said, I went to Catholic schools, and when I was 15, they closed the Black Catholic high school and desegregated my high school. And two of the young Black women who came to my school I got to be very good friends with. And one of them, Belinda Johnson, BJ, we called her BJ, um, went to Ebenezer Baptist Church. It was her church. And she took me there one Sunday to hear Dr. King speak. And I remember it was very, very different than the Irish Catholic Church that I went to normally. Um, there was a joy in it. There was a joy in the singing. There was a sense of community that was powerful. Um, but also the man preaching was he had, as you know, anybody knows who's seen him speak, he had it felt like God speaking through him. He had that sort of sometimes in ministry in Quaker meetings, it's there's this real sense that's coming through you, through one. And I had that sense about him. He had a way of speaking that was honest and compelling and held your feet to the fire and made you see what he wanted you to see. And made me feel that the injustice of what was going on around me. That in fact, in the part of the world, the white world I lived in, it wasn't visible necessarily. I'm always interested and sort of surprised when British people say they remember the first time they saw a person of color, because I don't. Always people of color in and out of our house, but never at the table, never, never in a situation that was equal. Um, and for me, the growing up in that what was essentially American apartheid, um, I'm still unraveling it, and I've been working on that for a very long time.
Mm.
Um, yeah, but I think the background of my childhood was the marches, the whole thing with Dr. King and Malcolm X and which way to go and what was happening and yet his voice if you listen to his speeches, he has an accent that is distinctively not just Southern but Atlanta, and I don't have it. I never had it because I went to Catholic schools, which were not populated by Southerners mostly. Um, yeah, I am sort of losing the thread here, but
Mm.
what
Well,
I learned from him and from BJ and Daryl, the other young woman, was that my life was different from theirs for reasons that were not to my credit or to their discredit.
mm. And you said you're still unraveling that. I mean, it sounds quite a traumatic realization, I suppose. And to witness that, when you say you're still unraveling it, and here we are in 2025,
Mm.
how can that be? How can it be that
Yeah.
I mean, do you mean just the human condition in the sense of what we do to each other?
Well, that certainly, but no, my own racism. I spent a good many years knowing I was not a racist because I didn't use the N word. I didn't see color. I didn't treat people differently. And it's only probably been in the last 15 years that I've understood what's wrong with that and that I am racist. I don't think, to be honest, and it's a little radical here maybe, but I don't believe you can grow up in Western society as a white person and not be racist. I, so I think it's probably not one's fault if one is racist, but it is our fault if we stay that way. And for me, I still find myself as much work as I do a lot of anti-racism work. I do a lot of work unraveling racism and pointing it out and talking about microaggressions and helping other white people understand what it means to be white, and what it means to not be white. Um, and I still sometimes find a little corner where I haven't got it yet, you know? And I am very lucky in that I have friends who are people of color who have pointed out to me
Mm.
and hold my feet to the fire and not let me slide, you know. So
And
so
you
and I think
and
go ahead.
you going back to you said that the church, the Ebenezer Church was it? So that was King's Church had an element of joy to it and community to it that you weren't experiencing elsewhere. Now, this is the kind of thing that really fascinates me because I sometimes feel that the joy and the spirit really coming to life in a vital way, in a joyful way, is sometimes not always happening in Quaker meeting as much as I would like. Now, what's your take on that? Is it part of the injustice that people who experience injustice are more able to see the joy, and that those of us living very comfortable lives just don't experience the joy as much? That because that's kind of my best analysis of that at the moment. But I wondered if you've got thoughts about that. What was the differences?
First of all, let me say that I don't know if you've ever been to an Irish Catholic church, but the singing, for example, is mostly people just mouthing the words and a few people singing, and some of them are on key. Um, the singing in a Southern Baptist, a Black Southern Baptist church is totally, people sing with their whole bodies, and the whole place it is echoing in the building, and is full voiced. It absolutely totally different. I don't know if you participated in the World Plenary last summer, but the African Quakers also do that. There's a joy in that they bring that is qualitatively different to the quiet joy that I find in British Quaker meetings. We worship at Westminster now, which is
Yeah.
a lovely meeting. I don't, but I do think it's part of being oppressed, and I don't think it's that people who are oppressed see the joy as much as they need the joy in a way that people who are not oppressed don't. James Cone, who's a black liberation theologian, I'm sorry, talks about he grew up in Arkansas, and he talked about that the place he found joy and commitment and community was in his church, and how much of a foundation that gave him to go out and do the work that he does or did. And I think it's the same in most of the black churches that I went to in the South, and I probably went to half a dozen. Um, Not too often because it really felt like while I was welcome, it wasn't my place, if that
Yeah.
makes any
Yeah.
sense. It wasn't mine, and it was um, white people can change the context or the sense of things, and yeah, so I was incredibly grateful to have been invited and welcomed there,
Mm.
by my friend, and never felt like I wasn't welcome. But I also felt that I was intruding, if that makes, I don't know if that makes any sense.
Mm.
It's sort of as an Irish person, or maybe a white person, or maybe a Catholic, I don't know, as who I am, as me, that level of embodied joy is something I wish I could do, but I don't have it. I can't. It's difficult for me to find it or to imagine myself feeling it, you
Yeah.
know. And
Yeah.
so yeah, it's kind of, yeah.
And see that I just find that really interesting. I mean, I I went along to a black church when I was up in Leeds, and again, I can really have a similar feeling to you that it's, I was made to feel very welcome, but it wasn't my place really.
Mhm.
And I visited once, and I was very grateful for it. Uh, uh, you just said it, because they're still oppressed, and I wonder. I was just talking just the other day to Nancy, who the video I just released a few days ago, and she's part of the meeting in Kenya, and she was talking about the noisy singing Quakers compared to the quiet meeting. And I
Mhm.
love the description you just talked about, full-bodied. I think this full-bodied joy, and we don't do that in Britain. But I mean, I wouldn't. I wouldn't say that current Quakers in Africa are oppressed and therefore joyful. I couldn't say that. Is
Um, Dan and I support, let me back up. One of the things that comes up often when you do racial justice work is reparations, which isn't about restitution to the people who are gone. It's about repairing the broken system that keeps people oppressed. And it, we live in Belgium. We chose Belgium 24 years ago. We live here. We love Belgium. It's a tiny, complicated little place, and we love it. But the wealth of Belgium, the wealth that built Quaker House, in fact, the wealth that built the Art Nouveau patrimony in Brussels came from Congo, came from horrid things that were done in Congo. And the people in Congo, the Quakers in Congo, um, live with the effects of that today. And Dan and I support a consortium of 11 small charities in South Kivu and Burundi, South Kivu of Congo and Burundi. Nine of them are Quaker led, and nine of them are in South Kivu, which is where the M23 rebels are fighting now. Most of these small charities, they work on to educate children so that maybe they won't have to leave their country to build a life. They work to educate children who are orphaned by this war, but also to empower women who maybe are alone or need to be empowered. They teach about gender-based violence. They do peace building training. They do alternatives to violence. They empower women in a lot of ways. They do such good work, and they right now they're pretty oppressed. They're many of them have had to stop their work because it's not safe because the war is there, and they are now surrounded by refugee camps where they it's easy to get overwhelmed in a refugee camp, and again the resilience um, that the people in the consortium have is amazing to me. But so I'm not sure I would say that there's not oppression there. There's certainly not everywhere, not everyone, but
Yeah, I suppose I'm making the link to the full-bodied joy in Quaker worship, and I suppose I was trying to explore why there is full-bodied joy in some Quaker meetings around the world, and we're talking about Kenya as an example. And I think perhaps perhaps in some of the American, I mean, the American Quakers have an evangelical tradition. Perhaps there's a similar, I don't know, full-bodied joy there as well. I've never been. Um,
I never have either. I was never a Quaker in the U.S.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so sadly, yeah.
So
I
can I come
don't
back?
know that. Yeah, but it is interesting, and maybe you don't have to have the oppression to feel it, but certainly I've seen it most in people who were otherwise oppressed or oppressed in other parts of their lives. Yeah.
Hmm, hmm. So let's come back to the Irish Catholic bit then, because you were talking there about you were looking for a different conception of God, really. And I mean, I love the Catholics. I've come to, I've grown up in Wales, and there's a certain suspicion, maybe, of the Catholics, which I grew up without ever knowing what that meant. There was never words, it was never spoken. And then
Mhm.
I worked in a Catholic university for over 20 years, and I came to know a lot of Catholics, and I really felt it a very loving community. So I'm just wondering what do you know? Because you've obviously been educated very deeply in the Catholic faith, which I have not. Are there similarities and are there key differences then? Because you've mentioned about Catholicism as almost a completely different way of seeing God. And yet, I don't really see that in the way that, as an adult, going to Catholic Mass, I don't see that. Whereas I do see that people who've been Catholics as children do have this sense of guilt which they can never really escape from, which I find upsetting, really. But I don't understand it, you know?
You know, and it's interesting. I have also met Catholics who have a different view or a different, um, I don't know, a whole different, it seems like a different sort of Catholicism, maybe. And so I don't know. I left the Catholic Church as soon as I could. So probably 1820. I was 18 or 20 when I left it. And pretty much haven't ever experienced it as an adult.
Right.
And that may be part of the difference that you see, is that you may know people who have experienced the Catholic Church as adults and who who have grown into a different understanding of it. My parents, my mother especially, were very devout, and yet I never saw that joy there. I never just saw the. It's not that it wasn't there, maybe, but I didn't see it. Dan was educated by, well, he also went to Catholic schools, way beyond me. He was educated by the Jesuits, and then went to a Jesuit university and to a Jesuit law school. So he's like
Mm.
super Jesuit and also now a Quaker, just saying. Yeah, I can't, I'm not sure I can say. I know that what you describe, I didn't see in the Catholic Church. And um, certainly had like a thorough Catholic education, about as much as you could get in Atlanta. We didn't have Jesuits and we didn't have a Jesuit college, so or
Mm.
a university. So yeah, it's probably as much as I
Mm.
could get. And yet I have no doubt there are people who feel that, or the Catholic Church wouldn't still be around, you know.
Mm.
Um, kind of like the current Pope, although we disagree about some things, um, but for me, this sense of, I use the word God. A lot of Quakers don't. I do. A lot of British Quakers don't. Let me say I don't. I do. I what I find in meaningful worship. Let me back up. What I found in a 12-step program is a spiritual awakening. It's just not even knowing that I needed one. And that happened through a series of steps that connected me first to something bigger than me, whatever you call it. I call it God, a higher power. Second, to myself in ways that I know myself in ways that I didn't before. And I have to say, I have a PhD in psychology. The things I learned in the 12-step program, I never learned in
Mm.
studying psychology. So I know myself deeply and in ways I would never have known myself otherwise. And then I learned to connect to repair relationships that I had broken. And so when I was finished with that, I had connections to God, to myself, and to other people, which made me spiritually whole. I didn't find that anywhere in the Catholic Church. And I'm not saying it's not there. I'm not saying people don't. But for me, what made me spiritually whole were those three connections. And that's really important to me.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. Um,
So do you think we do enough then in Quakers to bring people to a spiritual awakening? Because I suppose I don't. Again, one of the formational experiences for me within that Catholic setting was a Jesuit coming to speak to us and to lead retreats and workshops with us, and that whole kind of practice of standing and letting God look at you, and those kinds of processes, and Lectio Divina, and all sorts of specific practices. And I feel there's a great gap in Quakers. And what's interesting to me in these interviews is when I say to people, "Oh, that experience you just described as a spiritual awakening, was that in Quakers?" And they say, "Oh, no." And here we are again. You're mentioning the power of the 12-step program. That's not a Quaker setting. So what bothers me is that Quakers at the moment have a spiritual practice based in silent waiting,
mhm.
which is great and it really works for me. But it doesn't actually, in any organized way, bring people to a spiritual awakening. And I think that's a great lack in how we are at the moment and what we offer. People have to go outside of our tradition to find that.
I had thought of that. Um, yeah, that's gonna stay with me a bit. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I suppose the reason I want to talk about it is because those of us who have had some kind of experience, we know how transformative it is, and that before that, we are just not the same people. And what I see
Mhm.
in a lot of certainly younger Quakers who have not had anything like that happen to them, they're still very vocal and still very active and still very influential. But it's coming from a place where someone has not yet had a spiritual awakening. And that really bothers me.
Yeah, I think there are lots of ways to have a spiritual awakening. This was the one that worked for me. I think William James talked about that, didn't he, in Varieties of Religious Experience. He talked about the way that I came to it was what he called the spiritual awakening of the educational variety. Um, but I think there are lots of ways to have spiritual awakenings. This is the one that works for me. I know my Equipping for Ministry group has been very important to me in my Quaker journey. We, as a group, we gelled almost immediately, and even the tutors commented that this was more than normally happens. And then we started in early 2019. We started worshiping in every morning, 6 days a week, worshiping early morning on Zoom. And that also did a lot to sort of help us gel as a group. So when COVID came, we were already using Zoom. We were already worshiping on Zoom, and we had already, this really clear connection on Zoom. Um, we instead of a 2-year program, we were a 3-year program because of COVID, and so it was a little bit adapted, and Woodbrook did a lot of work to help us finish the program in a way that was meaningful to us. But those people, I think, are when I think of my spiritual community, that's who I think of.
Hmm.
And as I mentioned, Dan and I worship at Westminster, which is a wonderful, very lively meeting. Lots of people, there's young people, there's children, there's some diversity in the meeting, and there's a wonderful sense of community there. We worship online three times a month, and then once a month we go to London to be there in person. Um, and that's also an important spiritual community for us. Um, but I think that there are things. I think my EFM group, possibly if I hadn't had the 12-step experience, possibly could have gotten it that way. I think they're going to Quaker meeting once a week and then going home would not have done it for me. It wouldn't do it for me now. Wouldn't be enough. Um, but yeah, I think Woodbrook has tried, certainly through the Equipping for Ministry program, which is being revamped, I think,
Yeah, yeah.
has tried to do that, to set that up. But yeah,
I mean, I think leaving it to Woodbrook though, on a course that's, really quite expensive. I mean, I was intending to do that a decade or so ago, and I thought, oh well, financially that's not for me. But at the time, but I just wonder whether meetings, small meetings, even perhaps as areas, regional groups, that these kinds of spiritual community groups, like you've just described, really, small groups of people who meet together in worship frequently and work together. I'm not sure it always needs Woodbrook there holding their hands, does it? Doesn't always
no,
need academic study.
no, and I think that would be a different thing yet from what you just described, because the small groups need to, I think somebody has to hold them, um, if that makes any sense. I think I would love to have that. The kind of conversations that we're having here and
Mm,
that you've been having on these videos are exactly what I miss. Um, and I think would be very, very useful to have.
yeah, yeah.
I don't know how to structure that. And
No, no. Well, I mean, I hope we get thinking about these things and what the needs are. I was interested, you mentioned about your trauma counselling. I don't know if that was perhaps the word you used, but the way in which you found yourself traumatized by what you witnessed in Calais and how you found a way to deal with that. Because does that feel like a spiritual thing to you, or is it purely psychological?
um, I need to say that I am not a clinical psychologist. I haven't practiced, I haven't been involved with psychology for many years now, but I was an academic psychologist, not a clinician, which is why I had to find others to do that. My job was convener and doing all the logistics and fundraising and stuff. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm not a clinical psychologist, and it's important to say that. Um, I think the for me the work that it takes to shed that kind of trauma um, is essentially spiritual in nature. Um, there's a wonderful book called My Grandmother's Hands, written by an American psychotherapist named Resmaa Menakem. And it's about racial trauma, racialized trauma, and the kind of trauma that Black bodies feel and white bodies feel and police bodies. He makes a separate category for them. And in the book, he talks about that trauma and that it can be intergenerational, um, and that the work that it takes to shed it, and it's body work, it's physical work, it's spiritual work,
Mm.
and he has exercises in the book to do it. It's a book that we used in helping the helpers. But for me, it's spiritual work. It's also physical body work, because you have to sort of get rid of the sort of the sympathetic reaction and the sort of the adrenaline overload that comes, and the let your body let go of it, the tension and the trauma that it holds. Um, yeah.
The reason I ask, you see, is because I really want to raise the awareness and the profile around chaplaincy
Mhm.
in a way, because I've realized that what is forming me, and it still continues to form me, is that I go into situations where I'm face to face with somebody who is dealing with real despair and difficulties, and their life is falling apart, and um, and in the Quaker meeting, of course, I don't experience that. I'm not being with people who are falling apart in the same way. And I see these
Mm.
very nice, cozy relationships and um, experiences in the Quaker meeting. And then I see very difficult situations kind of on the edge of society in my chaplaincy work. And I know that
Mhm.
the spiritual experiences that I've had allow me to do that work and to stay
Yes.
in those spaces without crumbling. I sometimes might have to talk something through, or I find something, gosh, that person, is on my mind, but it's not in a traumatic way. I'm able to let it go and I'm able to be infused by joy somehow. And to in each moment of the conversation, even if it's only, 3 or 4 minutes that I'm with somebody, I'm able somehow to think, to be present enough to somehow reach a real moment in that, which is transformative for both of us. And
Mhm.
and I just wish that there was more of that within the Quaker contexts, um, which which I don't think we don't offer young people or even older people. We don't offer Quakers who come to us the opportunities very much to really see that this is what is on offer. You could really grow as a person like this.
Where do you think, where do you feel the wherewithal to do that work comes from for you?
Well, do you mean the motivation in the first place, or the wherewithal to actually start the work or to stay?
Maybe
They're two separate
maybe
things.
the resilience, the ability to hold the space and then find the joy. You talked about finding, being able to
Well,
find the joy again.
well,
Where does that
exactly.
come
And
from?
and it is a deeply spiritually connected space where you are literally feeling the living water of Christ, or whatever words these you have to use these wonderful words that are from some of the wisdom traditions, and we have Christianity. You have to use these words because nothing else comes close. So that's why I can go in there and not be burned, and not be crushed. Um,
I think for me, it comes from meaningful worship. It comes from that connection I find that sort of deep and profound connection is the only word I know for it that I find in meaningful worship. In a gathered, I don't always find it, let me just say. I can find in meaningful worship. And that's what fuels my ministry. That's what fuels the work that I feel called to do in the world. That's where the call comes from. That's where the energy comes from, and the living waters. That's where it comes from. Um, and and so for me, it is deeply spiritual because that's the root and the source of it.
yeah.
And without that, I know from my own experience, without that, I burn out very quickly.
Mm, mm.
Um, so
Well, that
yeah.
that's really interesting you said that, because I experience it as the other way around. So because of my prison ministry, I am fueled by this continual, every time I go in, I'm filled with God, filled with these feelings of and
Mhm.
connectedness with God. And especially within the chapel, within a prison context, it's a very special place. And
Yeah,
therefore
yeah,
I can go to a Quaker meeting, which is by comparison quite mild, let's say.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I can still access those feelings. So I'm not sure I could have stayed Quaker without the ministry in the prison kind of filling me, because in comparison, it's really quite a gentle space in Quakers. And I suppose that's partly why I have a little bit of a frustration really with Quakers, that I want to, you know, liven things up a little bit somehow.
No, I know. Sometimes I want to just go, where are the people who did Kindertransport. Where are we? Where are we now? I'd like to come back to words because I think words are important, and yet they're not important in a way. Um, we I find it very difficult to describe what I find in meaningful worship. And I know there's a big discussion right now among Quakers about whether we use the word God or whether we don't. And um, some people are afraid to use the word God because they don't want to offend anyone. And I just think we need to give each other some grace. You know, we we all experience something in meaningful worship, and describing it is not easy. Um, I'll give you an analogy. One of the things I do to sort of distract myself from difficult work is I judge chocolate competitions, which is like best job ever. But
I don't even know what
when
that means.
I know there are organizations who give prizes or medals for chocolate makers, and it's a big long story. But when a new origin of chocolate comes on the market, for example, when we finally get chocolate from Vietnam or from Tanzania, or a new origin or a new chocolate maker, maybe even the chocolate tasters that I know, we get together and we take it and we taste this, and we assume we're having this same deeply personal experience, and then we try to describe it, and we'll say, oh, there's red fruit in there, but it's not raspberries. Is it? No, it's earthy, but it's bright. And it's very hard to describe a taste, a flavor, unless we already have a word for it. It's very hard to describe. And I think when we go into a Quaker meeting, a gathered Quaker meeting, and we come out of it, it's very hard to describe. And we all have different words that we use. And I think we need to give each other grace to use the words that work for us,
Hmm,
because none of them are complete. They're all correct, but they're all incomplete. None of them capture the experience. And we're all sort of looking through our own lens at it. And we're all trying to describe the indescribable. And I use the word God because it's a word I have. I don't, we'll call it raspberry. I don't care, because the word points to it. The word isn't it. And I wish that Quakers could give each other more space to try to use the words that make sense to them.
sure.
And at the same time, I love it that Quakers is big enough to hold the non-theists and the theists and the Christians and the non-Christians and the Kenyans and the Congolese and all of us in all of our flavors of Quakerism. I love it that Quakerism is big enough to hold all that.
Mm, mm.
Yeah. So
Well, I mean, I agree with everything you've said there. And do you know, one of the things that I talk about a lot is eldership. And I really think that there is um, sometimes a reticence from people who are older who need to say this stuff. Because I mean, I suppose I really value hearing people speaking like this with a confidence that comes with age. Um, and it just is. It's just a fact. So I really love to hear that. And I suppose one of the things I'd like to talk about is you've used the word burnout because it's the opposite of resilience, isn't it? Of how do we avoid
mhm.
burnout? And do we have quite um, do we are we seeing Quakers in Britain in a state of burnout, really? And is that because of some kind of, well, let's start with that first. I see elements of burnout throughout Quakers in Britain, that there's a lack of resilience spiritually. Would you say you do?
It's a new idea to me. So I don't I have to sit with that for a bit. Can you say more about it? Why does it look like burnout to you and not something else?
Well, it looks to me like there's a lot of pronouncements, as I call them, a lot of kind of, calling for this and condemning that and warning of this and warning of that and a lot of, sound and fury. But actually, I mean, the work of sitting alongside somebody, whether that's on the streets of a city as a street pastor or a university chaplain or a hospital chaplain or working in a food bank, that to me is not, you're not going to burn out through that kind of work because it is intensely nourishing and difficult, but it is actually self-sustaining in some way because you're nurtured as well as putting yourself in that position. Whereas I find all of this political sounds that we're making, I it 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 becomes quite empty. I'm not seeing the spirituality in that anymore. I'm not seeing, that some of these Twitter, well, they're not on Twitter anymore. Some of these announcements they make now through, I think they're using Facebook, are they? I just think, oh, enough. Condemning this and condemning that. And so I just, I find it quite empty. And I observe that. And I suppose I think that they are in a state of burnout when they're making those kinds of pronouncements. And maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, right or wrong, I don't know, but I think I see it a little differently. And I think that ultimately, I may regret saying this, but I think ministry is in many ways personal. What I am called to do, I am called to do what I am called to do. And Quakers in Britain are not called to do what I'm called to do. So my ministry, and your ministry, sitting alongside someone, that's an individual calling. Um, and
Sure.
I think Quakers in Britain, and maybe we need to think about Quakers in Britain as what is Quakers in Britain? Well, first of all, it's the staff and Quaker House and the Quiet Company and all of that. But there's also 70 plus area meetings and the people who go there. And each of those is different, and each of those is made up of smaller meetings. And I think that the work we're called to do is for me, the spring of it, the energy from it comes um, from meaningful worship, from that connection that I find. It's channeled through me, and when I lose that connection, then it's all sucking out all of my energy, and I don't none's coming in, and that's when I risk burnout. Um, and I think that sitting alongside someone, which is such a loving and important thing to do. Just the ministry presence is so important. And as we listen to whatever trials that person is going through, there's either an energy that comes through us to hold the space for them, or an energy that comes out of us and leaves us empty. And that's when we have burnout. I don't know that that's what I see among Quakers in general. What I see among Quakers in general, I think, is fatigue. Tired. Quakers are tired, and and um, and there's a I don't know if it's Quaker because I've only ever been Quaker in a British context, so I
Mm.
don't know if this is Quaker or it's British or some combination of both. But there's a reluctance to have difficult conversations, an inability even to have difficult conversations that would resolve the conflicts we have in our meetings, in many meetings, and that would help us to understand, where we stand on certain issues, and if Quakers are going to speak with one voice and what that voice will say. I think I think we need to get better at that.
Mm.
Um, and I just think there's a real need for Quakers not to sort of fade away, um, to be sort of visibly um, making statements. I don't know. We've always, as they say in Strasbourg, Quakers have always, as unquakerly metaphor, have always punched above their weight.
Mm.
You know, Quakers have always made a bigger impact than their numbers would have predicted. But and I hope that we still do. But I think making statements about this, and there are people working on it, maybe nobody I know, you know. And so for me, it might seem like empty statements, but I believe that there are people working on it, and it's not my min, it's not what I'm called to do. Um, but I'm really happy. It's important work, and I'm glad that people are called to do it. I don't know if that answers your
Mm.
question or not. It's kind of
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it is interesting hearing other people's reflections on it, and I suppose what worries me is that we have a central staff that is paid and that is largely not Quaker, or at least partially not Quaker, and I'm less and less convinced that it is um, spiritually grounded enough to punch above its weight. And I think you can only punch above your weight, if we're going to use that phrase, from a very deep spiritual place. And I think it's lost that, which worries me really. Um, so perhaps we've naturally come to a place where we can consider the future then. I mean, how optimistic are you? How hopeful are you for British Quakers? Because you've just talked about difficult conversations. I think we're perfectly capable of having difficult conversations as a British person. We're perfectly capable of doing it. It's just that some people don't like it, and they tend to be winning at the moment in shutting these conversations down. But we're perfectly able to have them. Um, but what's your hopes then, and your thoughts for the future of Quakers in Britain as a whole?
yeah. I've been thinking about this because I knew you would ask. Um, I think the future in my mind, in my from where I stand, it depends on how well Quakers will be able to welcome people who are not like us, who are not white, middle class, European descent, and just to see how we currently exclude them. When I came to Quakers, my first meeting, the welcome I had was exactly perfect for me. I'm not sure that's the case for people who aren't sort of white European descent, middle class. And I think in many ways we exclude people, people of color, people with disabilities, people who are neurodiverse, people who are gender diverse. I think we exclude people in many ways that we're not aware of because we're nice middle class people. We don't know that, we don't see it. So I think an important thing in the future for Quakers will be to recognize how we are currently maybe excluding people. I'm not saying we all do that, but how people might be excluded, and get better at welcoming people who are not like us. Having these hard conversations about some of those very issues, and doing outreach. There's a reluctance to do outreach that um, there's a for me there's an enormous, I understand the reluctance to proselytize, but there's an enormous gap between proselytizing and being invisible, and
Mm,
that's where we need to live, in the
mm,
middle of that.
mm, mm.
So,
Do you mind if I ask you a bit more about the first one that you just raised there in terms of being more inclusive, if you'd say? Um, you see, I think that's been the analysis for the last 10, 15, 20 years for the bulk of the time that I've been involved in Quakers. And I just don't see it. I don't see that we are unwelcoming. And, I mean, I'm a gender diverse person myself. I mean, I don't see. I think we're overrepresented, in Quakers. We're quite clearly very, very heavily represented within Quakers. Now,
mhm.
and I suppose the thing about whether we're racially welcoming, racially diverse enough. Why is it that we talked earlier about the black churches? We felt that actually that's their space, that's their style, that's their home. And why are we so worried about that in the sense that we are, we both have PhDs and, here we are, we love Quakers. We're
Mhm.
both white and we've both got PhDs and as do many, many Quakers. Why are we so nervous about that? Why are we so embarrassed about that?
Because I think there's a certain richness that's lost. There's an enormous richness that's lost when we're all the same. And we're all the same and we're getting smaller. There are fewer of us, you know. As we have gender diverse people, we're having fewer children. As we're all my age, we're not, I'm not bringing children to the meeting, you know. So we're not, we need to either make more of us or bring more people in. We're gonna die. I mean, it's that way. And I think I had an interesting discussion with a friend who's gay about just that. And they said that, when Quakers welcomed gay people, it was a haven for people who didn't have a church where they felt seen and welcomed. With people of color, here comes a gross generalization that is as wrong as it might be right. But where people have a loving and welcoming, wholehearted, joyful church community, they don't need us, you know. They don't need what we offer, which is sort of quiet and contemplative. Um, and I think, and that's okay, not everybody needs or wants it. But I think if we are to survive as Quakers, we need to be a little more fiery, maybe, and a little more,
Well, I
a
agree
little.
with you on that. You see, I think we should be more fiery and I think we should be more religious for sure. I'm not convinced that we need to necessarily um, try to encourage more people of colour to join us. I'm not convinced we need to encourage more gender diverse people to join us. I mean, in fact, I'd quite like to encourage heterosexual young couples who are able to start a family and, as you say, make more Quaker babies. But then there's the issue of, well, why don't they stay? So I think there's all sorts of conversations we could be having. But what we always fall back to is what you started off by saying around we're not inclusive enough. And I just don't think that that's the right analysis anymore.
I think inclusive was not the word I used, is welcoming people who are currently being excluded. And families are a big part of that. We don't always arrange things so that families with children, so it's easy for families with children to attend. Not every meeting has children's meeting. Not every meeting has people who are capable of legally dealing with children. Not every meeting has a children's program. Not every meeting has programs that are welcoming to families. So it's not just about being racially diverse, which I personally think is very important, um, because I think there's a richness that is lost there. But I think it's also we're not welcoming to a lot of different kinds of people.
Mm.
And yeah.
So let's talk about the disability issue then, in terms of welcoming towards, you said about disabled people, neurodiverse. Do you have any
Mhm.
thoughts about what that means? What would welcome look like for in that aspect?
It's interesting because I was in a meeting yesterday about just that issue. And the problem is when I you and I work on welcoming people, we come up with a system that's very welcoming for people like us, you know? And we might be able to think about, okay, what if about somebody who's blind? Can they come into our meeting? Somebody who's in a wheelchair, can they come into our meeting? But there are other kinds of disabilities that may not be so visible, and therefore it's harder for us to know. And I'm not the person to say how to welcome people with disabilities. It's people with disabilities who need to say that. And I'm not the person to say how to welcome people. I have no children. I'm not the person to say how to welcome families because that's not mine either. Um, so I think the conversation needs to be not between people like us. If we
Mm.
want people who look like us in the meetings, we need to talk to them and say not what's preventing you, what's excluding you, you know. And sometimes, for example, with neurodiverse people, it might be the languages even for me when I came in, the language that's used and all of the acronyms and all of there's 20 minutes of notices. I don't have a clue what they said. Um, there's lots and lots of ways to exclude people. And I think if Quakers want to go beyond being a group of white middle class, very well educated people, then they need to think about how they're excluding people who aren't that. And that for me is going to will be important in the future of Quakerism. Um, so in lots of different ways, I think we exclude people. My own personal, the lens through which I see things is often racial. And but that's only part of it. Again, it's incomplete. I don't bring the whole story.
Yeah. Well, that's great. We've solved quite a few issues there. Well, um, even if we don't know the answers to them, we've kind of covered them, I should say, rather than solved. But it's been a pleasure talking to you, Kate. Thank you very much. And
Thank you, Emma.
to meet you.
Thank you. And happy Wednesday.